Chapter 4, Parts 1 and 2. Chapter 4, Strange Alliances. Part 1, Necron Command Center. Thurabis Plateau, Kronus. Even Necron technology wasn't fully proof against entropy, and 65 million years, give or take a few thousand, was an eternity by anyone's standard. The Lord in charge of the Necron installations below the surface of the world known as Kronus by its current primitive squatters was painfully aware of that fact. Systems all over the complex were damaged, often beyond repair. Even his databanks weren't spared by the countless eons that passed while he slept, awaiting for the galaxy to heal enough to sustain life once again. In fact, he should have awoken millions of years ago, after the warp storms caused by the final defeat of the Old Ones subdued, and the abominations spawned by them either starved out or retreated back to the abyss that spawned them. Finding himself awoken by a group of primitives pocking through his domain naturally resulted in a predictable violent reaction that saw all but one of the intruders neutralized in a short order. Only their apparent leader was preserved as an intelligence asset, while recon units were dispatched to scout the situation on the surface and secure the entrances to the complex. That was a simple standard operational procedure carried automatically by the now obviously demented caretaker intelligence of the complex, while it busied itself with awakening him. In this particular case, the fact that said intelligence wasn't fully self-aware and particularly intelligent turned out to be a blessing in disguise. Even in his diminished form, the Necron Lord could very well imagine the catastrophe of a proper command intelligence going demented and having unobstructed access to the complex to him. The current state of affairs was bad enough, as the reconnaissance units placed in its charge testified with their very appearance. The Necron Lord wasn't sure what he found more disturbing, that the first batch had returned wearing the flayed skins of primitive beings, just like those who intruded upon his domain, or the fact that it took him this long to notice and conclude that there was something wrong with said picture. Truly, he was currently a shadow of his former self. The first thing he did upon that revelation was to execute all error-checking programs and hardware build into his towering frame. While said maintenance and repair subroutines did their job, the Necron Lord peered at the blood-splattered automatons. There was something disturbing in their appearance that scratched at his incomplete databanks. Their presence felt wrong for a lack of better word. He set up some cycles to keep an eye on them and any others like them, before shifting most of his attention to the command intelligence. The state of its databanks and programming was even worse than his own. That was probably the best explanation for what the examination revealed. A data entity like the command intelligence wasn't supposed to experience emotions. No Necron was supposed to have retained their own, even if the Lord himself was a proof that truth was anything but absolute. Yet there it was, an amalgamation of corrupted code and damaged hardware leading to unintended consequences. The command intelligence had been enjoying itself by ordering its automatons to hunt down and butcher anything and everything that found its way within its domain. It was either a stroke of luck or a glitch that forced it to comply with the contingency directives, keep a captive for intelligence purposes, and awake him in the first place. That was something it should have done thousands of years ago when the first of those primitives had stumbled upon the Necron tunnels instead. It was a testament to how much he had degraded that the command intelligence could surprise him at this stage. By all means, it shouldn't have been bright enough to suspect what the Lord intended to do, much less do something about it. He was about to cut the command intelligence from the complex and bind it safely within its databanks for study at a later date, when the activity within its running code spiked. It knew, it felt fear, and it struck. The 4 automatons present in the small chamber where the Necron Lord currently resided moved as one, acting much faster than their appearance suggested possible. Within moments they surrounded him and struck as one, flensing blades slashing through stale air. The Necron Lord moved even faster, demonstrating that even in its current diminished state, he was still a power to be reckoned with. 4 pairs of blades met empty air, another one merely sliced through his tattered cape, while the rest met the unyielding alloy of his staff. He might have lost much in the endless eons of slumber and decay, many of his memories, his purpose, even his name, all in the name of preserving his combat capabilities first, his tactical and strategic acumen distant second. While the order of those priorities might have been flawed, for once, the execution didn't leave much to be desired. Metal clashed with metal, he hefted his staff and pushed away two of the defective automatons, sidestepped to swipe for a third, and kicked the fourth in the chest with enough force to cave it in and send it into the solid metal wall of the room. He struck the butt of his staff into the ground and released a pulse of raw energy that cascaded all around him, washing over the assailants and, more importantly, slamming into the chassis protecting the Command Intelligence's core. The discharge stunned the automatons, and instead of going after them, the Lord levered his staff at the data core and blasted it to slag. With that threat hopefully dismantled, he returned his attention to the rogue Necron warriors. Two of them were on the ground, shaking as raw energy overloaded their frames. The third one phased out of reality, only to appear behind the Lord and do its best to skewer him. The Necron leader let go of his staff and twisted around impossibly fast. He caught his assailant by what passed for its wrists and squeezed, leveraging the superior strength and construction of his own frame to crush the joints. He slammed its metal forehead into the face of the automaton for good effect, then planted his right foot on its chest and shoved, thus tearing its arms off. He threw them away, pointed his right palm at the crippled automaton, and melted a hole through its head with the weapon built into said hand. The time it took him to dispatch that attacker gave enough time for the other two to recover from the overload and find their feet. They charged him, one coming straight at the Lord, while the other one phased out, preparing a sneak attack. For its trouble, the first automaton received a point-blank blast that decapitated it. However, the second one was more successful. The Necron Lord caught its left wrist, yet it managed to slam its other arm under his armpit. Flensing blades perfectly able to slice through any known living being with pathetic ease found little purchase into the necrodermis of the Necron Lord. He found the blunt impact a larger inconvenience than the thin blades causing shallow cuts into his metal hide. He grabbed the head of the offending machine, ignored its flailing, and melted a neat hole straight through its cranium. If he could, the Necron Lord would have sighed in exasperation, which merely underlined how far he and the facility technically under his control had fallen. While there was a lot of data left intact pertaining weapons, vehicles, even space travel, little useless things like the devices needed to communicate verbally were lost, at best stored into corrupted archived in need of thorough repair and data recovery. It was embarrassing, really, considering that one of the devices malfunctioning on his frame was his voice caster. He made sure that the 4 automatons were dismantled for good, then did the same for the Command Intelligence. That done, it was time to take direct control of the facility, fix himself and recover as much of his memories as possible, while figuring out the state of the planet and what must be done about it. While thinking about it, the Lord recalled that he had a captive slatted for interrogation, which might no longer be the case given the Command Intelligence's proclivities. A query to the subroutines monitoring the facility revealed the fate of said captive. For some arcane reason the Lord wasn't sure he wanted to ponder, the Command Intelligence had decided that it was a good idea to strip the flesh off from the primitive and replace it with necrodermis, while doing its best to make sure said primitive retained its mind, and had been awake and aware during the whole process, which had taken much longer than it should. By the Citan and the Silent King, just what had been wrong with that thing? He sent a query to the new unit placed in the corner of the facility's network designated at Thomas Maccabee, and to his utter lack of surprise, the primitive was on the edge of going completely insane. Part 2. Necron Command Center, Thurabis Plateau, Kronus. A quick and dirty interrogation of the captured intelligence asset, combined with what little reconnaissance assets were currently available and responding to orders, confirmed that while the tactical situation hadn't quite gone to the Krork, it was heading there fast. A nearby peninsula was busy falling in the hands of warp abominations and their thralls. The Eldar had an expeditionary force present on the surface, which was in the process of establishing a forward operation base. They were busy stirring the so-called Orcs, a fortunately devolved Krork strain which needed purging before it could evolve and become a credible threat. Next came the primitives. The intelligence asset species, now designated humanity, was supposedly the dominant power both on the planet and, if the asset could be believed, across the galaxy too. The Necron Lord needed independent confirmation on the later point. From what little he could detect, The humans on the surface might be numerous, yet they appeared to be the most technologically stunted species running amok on the tomb world. Last and arguably not the least were the so-called Tau, the blue-skinned primitives. Recent events, namely a large-scale engagement between the available human, Orc and Tau forces, pointed towards the fact that cooperation with the former would preclude cooperation with the later. That state of affairs was less than ideal. All preliminary projections pointed at a defeat being statistical certainty if the available Necron forces had to engage the various squatters by themselves. The tomb world had suffered too much damage. Putting it back into a semblance of order would take too long even without Eldari raids, which were a given the moment those pests figured out how weak the Necron position was. Then there were the abominations as well, which needed to be exterminated with extreme prejudice. Analysis complete, the Necron Lord made up his mind and returned his attention to strengthening his position. He needed to reasonably secure the complex, fix himself to an acceptable state, including a way to communicate directly with the primitives, and only then he could afford to approach one of the two somewhat palpable factions. He had to deal with the rogue reconnaissance units, killing indiscriminately everything in sight too, before they made any chance of an alliance a moot point too. The Necron Lord consulted the ravaged data net of the facility and headed towards the closest stasis vault containing scarabs and the parts to build more of those useful automatons. It was high time to put his domain in order. In the meantime, repair subroutines kept working upon the decayed parts of his memory, struggling to recover even the tiniest scrap of information. Victory Bay Kronus. Note to self, charging orcs in general, and orc bosses in particular, while riding a chimera and waving a sword like a maniac is a bad idea. I had the metal to prove it. A large part of my right side was now bionic, either because the orcs mauled it, or the Tau and their Emperor-damned Kroot fucked it up. Now that the painkillers were out of my system, the bionics itched something fierce, not to mention the parts where they connected with flesh, bone, and worst of all, my nerves hurt like son of a bitch. That was normal too, at least according to the cog boys. Filling me with more painkillers would numb the pain, however it would also significantly increase the time it would take for the bionics' machine spirits to get comfortable where they were and learn to work in concern with me. Or something in that vein. I wasn't paying too much attention at that point. I was too busy trying to restrain myself from strangling the smug cogboy lecturing me with his mechadendris. My consolation prize for getting mauled nearly to death and crippled was that the plan worked, more or less. For the time being, the orcs were too busy running or fighting among themselves, and we shouldn't be suffering concerned attacks from that corner until they managed to get themselves a new war boss, which would be never if we had anything to say about it. That in turn gave us some breathing space to deal with the other threats on Kronus. The Chaos and Traitor incursion on the Deimos Peninsula was the primary threat, and we had to purge it as soon as possible. Figuring how to do it with the assets available would be the topic of a meeting I would be having with General Alexander and Captain Thule in less than an hour. Unfortunately, we would be unable to throw everything we had against the Chaos forces. Doing so would beg for either the Tau or Eldar to backstab us, and if that wasn't bad enough, there was confirmed Necron presence on Kronus, which was an existential threat as well. Given the circumstances, the last thing I needed were painkillers that might mess up my judgment even further, which, needless to say, made me particularly irritable. On the other hand, the way the common troopers treated me ever since I awoke at the makeshift apothecarium was a mixed blessing. Everyone who saw me straightened up and stared, looking with wonder and awe, instead of the ill-disguised fear and apprehension that I knew would meet an Inquisitor walking in the open. It took me a bit too long to connect the dots and figure out this was all because of my crazy stunt against the orcs. The poor bastard were looking at me as if they expected that I would be repeating that particularly insanity as a matter of course. That was something I had no intention of doing ever again if I had any other acceptable alternative. The stabbing pain in my side at every movement was a grim reminder of the price such heroic deeds extracted from those brave or insane enough to attempt such stunts. "Inquisitor, I'm glad to see you back on your feet." A deep, jolly voice exclaimed behind me and made me jump, which predictably felt like an angry orc just buried its chopper in my side. Antea's armor-clad figure materialized behind me like from thin air, and he peered at me. I sensed him give me a curious once-over through the warp before reining in his power. It could have been much worse, all things considered. Are you all right? Considering that I should be very dead right now, I'll better than I have any right to be. I answered quietly. Nonsense, you acted in the best traditions of the Imperial Guard, and most importantly, it worked. The librarian smirked. If it was dumb and it worked, then you were lucky and the Emperor looked out for you. I shot back. There's that too. Antaeus nodded sagely, and just like that, the levity he surrounded himself with vanished. I'm glad you're all right, Inquisitor. We've got a situation requiring your expertise, he stated gravely. My expertise? As far as the command staff of either the Imperial Guard, the Blood Ravens, and what little Imperial naval assets we had in orbit went, I was among the most junior and least experienced, my status as an Inquisitor notwithstanding. Antaeus clearly heard the incredulity in my voice, but disregarded it and motioned me to follow him. Considering the situation, the opinion of the Ordo Xenos is going to be vital, Inquisitor. Please follow me. I'll explain once we're at General Alexander's HQ. I don't like the sound of that, Antaeus. Don't worry, Inquisitor. You'll like it even less once you know the details. A hint of grim amusement found its way in the librarian's voice. What in the Emperor's name did I do to deserve this? 15, Chapter 4, Parts 3, Latin 4. Chapter 4, Strange Alliances. Part 3, Eldar Fob, Tyrea, Kronus. The frozen north of the continent held a stark majesty that was largely untouched by the brute hands of the Mon-Ki. If it was up to her, Farseer Taldir would have seen to it that the arrogant primates wouldn't be able to ruin anything ever again, which was one of the many dreams she held along with the great majority of her Bealtan compatriots. She had a dream that one day her people would return to their rightful place as rulers of the galaxy and put everything the way it was supposed to be. In the meantime, it fell upon her and her fellow Eldar to do their best to preserve as many of their people as possible, and when practical, weaken their various enemies. It was in the pursuit of this mission she brought her war party to Kronus. Ungir, the ancient enemy, slumbered here. Taldir foresaw their awakening. She saw how weak they would be, and hurried to capitalize of this priceless opportunity to nip a danger in the bud. The Farseer did expect that the Mon-Ki would be furious over her actions back on the planet they called Lorn V. She did expect that they would try to follow her. Naturally, Taldir expected that the beasts would fail to actually keep up with her. That, she reluctantly admitted to herself, might have been a mistake. Shortly upon her arrival, Lucas Alexander, the Mon-Ki she tangled with on Lorn V, arrived as well, along with a sizable force of the crewed Imperial ships. The upstart Tau, who had been slowly taking control of Kronus, objected to the Mon-Ki coming back in strength, which soon led to a massive battle in orbit. While unanticipated, that development did offer an opportunity to cripple the primitives and in one swift strike gain the upper hand. The Farseer sighed. That had been another miscalculation. She had her small yet potent fleet moving in position to fall upon the weakened combatants when a fourth fleet arrived in system. It was a second Mon-Ki task force, spearheaded by a strike cruiser bearing Space Marines. That put Taldir's plans into disarray. She couldn't allow the Mon-Ki to gain uncontested control of the orbitals and was forced to act, engaging the humans in open battle. The Eldar's superior voidcraft, ships and weapons proved themselves without peer, yet Taldir simply lacked sufficient numbers to win a decisive victory. They would have won anyway, if it wasn't for the rude arrival of swarm of orc hulks that fell upon everyone, turning the battle into pure chaos. In the end, she had to recall her surviving forces, while a mauled Mon-Ki flotilla took the orbitals. She would have been in better spirits if that debacle was the worst way her visions of the future went off the rails since her arrival in this damned system. Stirring up the local feral orc population to act as a distraction while the Eldar struck should have been simple, easy even. The Mon-Ki should have fought among themselves, encouraged by a few strategic assassinations and misdirections courtesy to Taldir's warriors. It was even true for a time, then everything changed, leaving her drifting among a sea of uncertainty. She didn't foresee the survival of the orc warlord she humiliated on Lorn V, much less that he too would make an appearance on Kronus, thus upsetting her plans first in orbit, then on the surface. Said brute united the majority of the fear orcs on the planet and used them to launch a massive war against everything and everyone. As if that wasn't bad enough, Taldir failed to foresee the outcome of his short-lived campaign of terror. The orcs should have swept over the Mon K defensive lines with only a swift strike by the Tau, allowing the humans to survive the onslaught. The resulting fighting should have weakened those three factions significantly, making them easy prey for strategic strikes, which would have left them crippled and easy pickling once the Eldars dealt with the real threat, the Necrons. Of course, that prediction didn't come to pass. First, the mad Mon Ki summoned Warp Storm, one that now threatened to engulf the planet and throw them all to the non-existent mercy of She Who Thirsts. Next, Gorguts the Brute managed to either get himself killed against the humans or the next best thing. Losing his massive army, something that Taldir could have used to throw against the madmen on the Deimos Peninsula. The only thing that went more or less as predicted was that the Tau did act the winner of the clash between the Orcs and the Mon Ki. They were less successful than predicted as well, due to the humans for once almost acting as civilized being and ceasing killing each other to face the new threat. The Mon K positions were still unbroken, the Jungir were awakening, chaos would soon spill forth from the Deimos Peninsula. Taldir huffed in frustration. There had to be a way to win this. She was an Eldar Farseer, she should be able to see the way. It was her role, her sole purpose. The orcs failed, the brutes mucking up. That really shouldn't have been much of a surprise. They still had significant numbers, like the two tribes she used to protect the approaches to her base. Perhaps their broken horde could still be useful as a distraction. However, they would no longer be able to break the Mon Ki by themselves. Taldir's warriors were undoubtedly up to the task, however she had limited numbers at her disposal and real enemies to face here on Kronus. Speaking about the Jungir, she had already dispatched scouts to harass and sabotage their efforts to properly awaken this tomb world, which all things considered should have been her primary concern. However, with the Jungir being as crippled as she foresaw, she had time to deal with them. First, she had to neutralize the Chaos incursion, yet in order to deal safely with them, she had to remove the Mon Ki out of the equation or risk the crude humans taking her forces from behind during their hour of triumph, and that simply wouldn't do. The Mon Ki had to go first, that much was obvious. In that regard, the Tau upstarts might just prove useful, she decided. Now she just had to decide how to approach them and make sure that anyone she brought with her to parley with them could control their emotions and actions. Having to threat with such beings who had no concept of respect for their betters, well, that naturally stirred the blood of any and all Bieltan warrior with even an ounce of self-respect. Tau Military HQ, Kronus. Shaso Kais had seen his share of debacles before at the hands of the human super soldiers and their insane cultists. Unfortunately, his emergency deployment to secure Kronus had all the hallmarks of yet another disasters. If he had to face just the regular human military, the Tau commander was sure he could prevail. All things considered, his people's technology and better tactics were generally superior to what the Imperial Guard could bring to the battlefield. The presence of the human super soldiers changed the equation, and not in a good way. The arrival of an orc war boss who united the local feral population was a further complication, one that should have worked in the Tau's favor. Kai stared at the detailed tactical display and grumbled a quiet curse. The plan had been solid: let the enemies of the greater good exhaust each other before striking at them and using superior mobility and firepower to defeat in detail the survivors of said clash. The plan came close to working as well, even if the orcs fared much worse than even the most pessimistic projections. The fire cast struck the flank of the weakened human defenders and were on the verge of a breakthrough that, if exploit, could have ended this campaign in one master stroke, only for the Space Marines and enemy super-heavy armor to intervene, bog down the swift assault, and allow the Imperial Guard to regroup and redress their lines. At that point, Kais had to call off the assault or risk wasting too many of his warriors for questionable gains. After all, there were other enemies upon Kronus to deal with, like the insane cultists who apparently took over the Deimos Peninsula not so long ago. Then there were the Eldar who struck during the fleet engagement in orbit. The same Eldar who requested a diplomatic less than an hour ago, one that ethereal Shiores gleefully approved. Their delegation was supposed to arrive any moment now, and Kais couldn't shake off the feeling that he was about to be screwed by the numbers by the knife ears. Rumor had it that they had that refined to an art form. Part 4. Tau Military HQ, Kronus. The little blue aliens attempted to impress Taldir with their military might. That was her best guess about the parade formation that greeted the Farseer and her honor guard. Rolls upon rolls of hover tanks and gunships flanked the only free path leading to the command post. In front of every single vehicle stood a squad of infantry armed with pulse rifles backed up by large armored suits complete with built-in oversized railguns. The primitives, their barbaric Kroot auxiliaries, and the Vespid insects buzzing around certainly lacked the proper deference and respect for their betters. That much the Eldar could sense from the gathered troops without even trying. The same was true for her warriors, a cadre of banshees and aspect warriors striding proudly behind her, displaying their perfectly crafted arms and armor, which unfortunately failed to properly awe the aliens. That fact naturally put Taldir's guards on edge, and their slowly boiling emotions spilled over her too, forcing her to work even harder to keep her composure. This right there was a prime example of how far her people had fallen. Once upon a time, when the Eldari reigned upon the galaxy, no one would have dared show such lack of respect for their betters. The Farseer bottled down her emotions and sent a wave of reassurance to her comrades. There was one useful benefit of this cute display of martial might the Tau put forth. It was now obvious that while crude, their weapons and vehicle weren't as crude as those of the Mon-K. They were going to be useful tools for the Eldar, and while it wouldn't be as satisfying to see the upstarts die at the hands of the Mon-K, as it would be for the Eldar to put them in their place personally, die they will. Taldir schooled her features, smiled beautifully, and slowly and deliberately removed her helmet once she stood face to face with the Tau leaders. Their military commander towered above her, clad in his combat suit, which was almost impressive for something built by such a primitive species. Beside him stood the so-called Ethereal, the representative of the civilian leadership of the Tau, who was in fact ruling over his clueless subjects thanks to liberal application of pheromones. The single interesting thing about that was the fact that said chemicals apparently worked on a wide range of aliens, which all things considered wasn't particularly common. Naturally, said pheromones had no effect on the superior Eldar physiology. Taldir cradled her helmet in the crook of her arm, leaned on her spear staff, and relished at the reactions her psychically touched appearance had on the Tau. Now she had everyone's undivided attention, which was a good thing, even though she didn't appreciate beings little above common beasts drooling over her in their enclosed helmets. The primary downside was that with her own helmet off, the Farseer could very much smell the Ethereal's pheromones, and frankly, they stank worse than a pile of burning orcs. It was a close call, however. Taldir managed to keep her beaming expression on without showing even a flicker. Not that it would have mattered in the short term. The Ethereal was all but smitten with her already, though the Tau military commander was apparently made from a sterner stuff which got him a very tiny and very grudgingly given grain of respect. Still, that was certainly damning him with faint praise, as it was proper. "Greetings, Tau. I am Farseer Taldir," the Eldar sang, keeping the sneer she felt far away from her voice. "It is a pleasure to make you an acquaintance." Keeping a civil tone with these beings was one of the hardest things she had ever done to date, still duty called. "The pleasure is mine, my lady." The Ethereal at least bowed, even if the display was crude and graceless as expected. "I am Aunel Shiores, and this is Commander Shaso Kais." The commander merely gave her a sharp nod, which merely underscored the unease he radiated. He was struggling with the emotions her appearance stirred within him, which was both amusing and infuriating. An exchange of empty and false platitudes, at least on Taldir's side, followed, before finally the Ethereal invited her and her party to enter the command center. At least inside, the Tau had proper climate control, and the place was almost clean enough to pass muster. The command and control instruments were actually close to adequate as well, at least for species blind to the tides of the great ocean. Both of you are important, busy people, Commander, Ethereal, Taldir sang, layering her words with strands of power. I won't presume to waste your time and will come straight to the point. We, Tau and Eldar alike, have a common problem and cause here on Kronus. This pleasant world now suffers under the dual infestations of Mon-K, their insane cultists and feral orcs. Sadly, many humans, especially among their leadership, persist in resisting the greater good. The Ethereal uttered sadly, "It is a tragic state of affairs, truly." Taldir nodded in commiseration, valiantly resisting the urge to roll her eyes. "We're here to address this tragic turn of events, are we not?" She smiled charmingly. "I propose an alliance. Together, our people can do great things. We can put to rest the threats plaguing this world. For the greater good, of course. For the greater good of the Eldar species anyway." "I'm heartened to hear you say this, my lady Taldir." The Tau grinned at her, and in its glee sprayed even more pheromones into the enclosed space of the command center. Doing so, he came a heartbeat away from being incinerated from the inside out, while Taldir struggled not to choke on the stench. "I am overjoyed you approve of my suggestion, my dear Arnel," Taldir gushed. "Shall we discuss the details of our new arrangement?" An hour later, Commander Kais struggled to figure out how exactly he ended up agreeing to spearhead an offensive straight into the teeth of the human defenses in order to reduce them once and for all. The plan was solid, if expensive. Eldar strike teams would move in behind the front line, disrupt enemy command and control, hunt down artillery and either neutralize or slow down their reserves. That in turn would allow the Tau to pierce the defensive lines, use their infantry to annihilate them once cut off, while their more mobile units would move through the breaches, exploit them and crush any and all reserve formations. Once that was done, they would strike in concern at Victory Bay and erase the Imperial Guard presence from the planet, cut off and contain the Space Marine stronghold as well. Phase 3 would be to dispatch the insane cultists while leaving strong enough force to fix the human super soldiers in place. Dealing with them for good and finally hunting down all the feral orcs on Kronus would be the capping stone of the whole campaign. The plan was deceptively simple in outline. Now Kais had to flesh it up into something his soldiers could put to actual use. While he still felt some unease about the alliance, it had the Watercast's mark of approval. In fact, it had Shiore's gleeful and full support, which was enough for the commander. As usual, the Ethereals knew what they were doing. 16. Chapter 4. Parts 5006. Chapter 4. Strange Alliances. Part 5. Victory Bay Kronus. When all was said and done, I've been too busy, my mind too preoccupied to appreciate Victory Bay. Ironically, now that I blithely walk towards the next impending disaster, I spent a bit of time to look and enjoy the sights, if for no other reason to keep my mind from jumping to the worst possible conclusions. First, and obviously, while a large city, Victory Bay was no hive, which was a good thing. Otherwise, everyone would likely need a rebreather at least in order not to choke on the fumes. There were actual trees lining up the streets, even various parks dotting the place, even if they were on the small side. There was a freshness in the air despite the promethium smoke from countless military vehicles doing their best to choke it down. Even the architecture wasn't entirely in the Empire's preferred Gothic style. There was a distinct lack of gargoyles and such leering down from most buildings, which was a nice change as well. Actually, the place was quite vibrant, especially now that we were here in force and people were cheering us when not too busy working or aiding in fortifying the place. While there were a lot of fools who actually welcomed the Tau on Kronus, there were even more good Imperial citizens who were glad we were here to deliver them from Xeno rule, which was heartening. My brief moment of levity withered as we approached General Alexander's command center. The surrounding space crawled with at least an order of magnitude more security than the situation as I knew it warranted. There were trenches, bunkers, and dug-in heavy weapon emplacements all over the place, tanks covered in fighting positions, sentinels milling around with glowing multi-lasers, even a bomber flight circled overhead. 2 infantry companies stood near the entrance of the CP, looking uneasily at it. One was made of Kassakin commandos in sealed carapace armor, carrying heavy weapons, while the other held the bulk of the Ogryn we had planetside if I recalled right what Alexander had available. Needless to say, that sight didn't fill me up with confidence. I glanced at Antaeus. However, his helmet wasn't much help in divining what fresh threat to life and limb awaited us. The cogboys were here in strength too, if the excited chatter in binary coming from the CP was anything to judge by. At least someone was happy about whatever this was. I suspected I wouldn't be as overjoyed as our AdMech contingent appeared to be. Moments later, I was proven right. Inquisitor, I'm glad to see you more or less intact. Alexander gave me a firm nod when he has me enter. There have been certain new developments requiring your attention. Thula's huge form stood beside the general. The captain of the Blood Ravens was barely able to fit into the room, though it wasn't particularly small. The commander of our Astartes contingent offered a silent nod in recognition, however left the explanations to Alexander. I'm at your disposal, General. What is the situation at hand? Alexander glanced at the cogboys, who, if anything, grew more and more excited by the moment. First, our friends in the Mechanicus are seeking a most holy relic while aiding us in fortifying the city against Xeno incursions. The arm cannon of a blessed god machine, as they put it. We'll have to recover and protect it at all costs, obviously. While he delivered that explanation in a matter-of-fact manner and with the proper panache, it was obvious that Alexander wasn't thrilled at the need to secure yet another critical point, one that wouldn't be of military benefit for our campaign to liberate Kronus, or avoid losing the planet and be murdered horribly for as long it took for reinforcements to arrive. The silver lining here was that when the cogboys at large heard what their local counterparts stumbled upon, there will be Mechanicus assets racing our way, for all the good it would do to us in the short term. That's an excellent news, praised the Omnissiah. I offered a smile to the cogboys and topped it off with the sign of the Aquila. However, as nice as this turn of events is, I don't believe that why you called me, General. Unfortunately not, Inquisitor. There are two items of interest that concern us all, and they're linked. First, a few hours ago, a Xeno diplomatic party, or what passed for it, approached one of our recon teams. The leader of these Necrons on Kronus wants to negotiate. As a sign of goodwill, the sarcasm Alexander could put into words was something to behold. He offered us concerning bit of intelligence, one that was just confirmed by orbital surveillance and Astartes reconnaissance teams. The Eldar and Tau met not so long ago, and all signs point at them forging an alliance against us. The Blueskins are currently mobilizing for an all-out assault on our positions. Ah. Well, we were fucked. That thought aside, Necrons wanted to negotiate. What insanity was this? Then you want my opinion on meeting the Necrons and using them against the other enemies of humanity, desecrating this world. I chose my words very carefully. Correct, Alexander stated flatly. We have the forces available to deal with the Tau, especially when working in concern with Captain Thula's Astartes. However, we're likely to suffer heavy casualties we can ill afford when the Deimos Peninsula is swarming with heretics and agents of the great enemy. They should be our priority target, however. If we move against them now, we'll risk being defeated in detail. Damn, Eldar. Liberal orbital support? While we technically control the orbitals right now, our naval elements are damaged and stretched thin between protecting our transports and keeping surviving enemy naval elements honest. There is the remnant of a Tau battle group in system, as well as the survivors from the Eldar flotilla that engaged us before your arrival, Inquisitor. Our naval commanders aren't confident that they can keep Victory Bay safe if we provoke the enemy by purging their strongholds with cleansing orbital fire. This was likely the longest I've heard Thule speak to date. The Bloodraven captain didn't bother hiding his frustration and displeasure at our strategic situation. In that case, it might be prudent that we at least hear what the Necrons want to say. To the best of my admittedly very limited knowledge, this might be the first time these particular Xeno are willing to talk with us. If nothing else, a meeting might be a source of precious intelligence, which the Ordo Xenos will appreciate. The possibility of such meeting and the Eldar-Tau alliance is the reason for the increased security, is it not? Yes, Alexander nodded grimly. The Necron envoy told our recon element that he'll be along soon after we decide to meet with him. No need to try and contact them. So there was another reason for the large contingent of cogboys stuck in the command center. You think they're listening to us right now, or at least that is what they wanted us to believe, I concluded. We've provided all available countermeasures, the head cogboy announced. We're fairly confident. Static electricity washed over us, green lighting blinded me, and I scrambled for my las pistol, while clawing at the warp for power and trying to blink off bright spot away from my eyes. Greetings and salutations, a deep, bombastic voice announced. Hold your fire. Thule's voice thundered, bringing me to a halt. If even a few of us tried to shoot in the well-packed-up command center, we were liable to murder more of our people than whatever Xeno trickery just descended upon us. The Mechanicus contingent didn't necessarily agree if the angry binary chants echoing throughout the CP were anything to go by. The ominous hum of powering up weaponry reinforced that impression. Finally, my sight cleared, and I saw a small dark green machine floating above the hololith table, which was dominated the center of the room. The thing was shaped like an insect, and its form was disturbingly familiar. I'm the voice of the Necron Lord of Kronus, who unfortunately has his voxcaster currently damaged. The unknown voice continued. Despite the artificial tang of said voice, the choice in words and inflection was distinctly human. We're ready to arrive and conduct negotiations, preferably before the Eldari and their newest minions come to kill you all. Everyone in the room, even the floating Xeno device, turned their eyes upon me. Allowing you to come here would allow you to attempt a decapitation strike, I began. However, you could have teleported a bomb instead. I continued, my mind racing. So much for the AdMech countermeasures. Most disturbingly, now that our cyborg friends had a few moments to get over their outrage, more than a few of them chattered excitedly while observing the Xeno device. The thought never crossed my lord's mind, honestly. Sure. I glanced at Thule and Alexander. Both had their weapons drawn and at the ready, however neither of them appeared willing to immediately attack. The general gave he a tiny nod, while Thule remained still as a statue. I'm willing to allow a diplomatic meeting. We won't attack your envoy during it unless provoked. I carefully didn't extrapolate what might be considered a provocation. Good enough, I guess. Stand by. We'll be there momentarily. A moment later, a second flash of light blinded me, prompting almost everyone present to curse. When my sight returned, there were two tall metal figures in our midst, and everyone aimed their weapons at them. Fortunately, no one pressed the trigger. Yet, Part 6, Victory Bay Kronus. The smaller figure had an uncanny similarity to a human. If I didn't know better, I would have concluded that the Xenos took some poor bastard, stripped the flesh from his bones, and replaced it with metal. The other one was much larger. In fact, it competed with fully armored Astartes for size, and had to hunch leaning on a staff spear hybrid, which cracked ominously with sinister green energy, the same one that shone from the envoy's eyes. Greetings and salutations, humans, the smaller figure declared grandly. That was the same voice we spoke with through the insect-like machine, which still floated above the hololith. I am honored to present the Necron Lord in charge of this tomb world. We hope this is the beginning of a long and mutually beneficial friendship. It bowed with a flourish, and I'm sure no one shot it due to the sudden movement, only thanks to the Emperor's mercy, and the fact we were all too stunned by the display to react as fast as we usually would. If the Xeno were hostile, they just missed a great opportunity to mow down a lot of us while we were too busy gaping at them. Everything we knew, everything we've been taught and experienced so far went in the face of such a cordial greeting, which naturally meant this was either a trap. There was something we didn't know, or the universe had decided to cease making any sense whatsoever. The damnest thing was that the alien actually sounded genuine. Go figure. You requested this meeting, Xeno. Explain your intentions, Captain Thule demanded. As befitting to an Astartes, he was among the first people to recover. We're both in an unenviable position. The Eldari and those Tau upstarts just allied. There is an abomination incursion upon this world. The Orc threat is merely temporarily diminished. While my lord has called for reinforcements, we're yet to receive answers and ETA on their arrival, which means we'll have to deal with the local problems with our currently limited means. An alliance of convenience, rises the statistical probability that both of our sides will survive long enough to be reinforced if we're unable to win outright. Does your lord have a name, and why isn't he speaking for himself? This question came from one of the senior Mechanicus representatives. Their whole contingent was divided between making what suspiciously sounded like covetous sounds while watching the Xeno and the technology they had on display, while the rest of them were angry and agitated, presumably at the affront to the Omnissiah the Necrons were. Another division in the ranks was a complication that we didn't need. Our tactical position on Kronus is less than ideal, that much is no secret, I said, choosing my words very carefully. If I screwed up now, the absolute best outcome I could look up to in the future would be a nice clean bolter round through the head. Nevertheless, why should we even entertain the idea of actually working with aliens? No matter the outcome of this campaign, doing so can see us all shot as traitors, or worse, depending on what our superiors decide once they turn up with a proper fleet, I pointed out. The two Xenos looked at me for long, tense moments, and the large one gave me a single nod. Politics, we really should have seen this coming. In our defense, my lord has been stuck into stasis for over 60 million years, and he's still recovering. The same is true for the bulk of our assets, thus the need of an alliance in the first place. The speaker shrugged in a very disturbing human-like fashion. And what would have your lord done if he had all his assets in fighting shape? Exterminated the Eldari, abominations and orcs, given the rest of you squatters a chance to leave. This planet has been a Necron world for longer than your species has existed. No offense meant. We're reasonable people, not like some of our compatriots. That declaration prompted a litany of curses and incredulous exclamations from our contingent. I knew that the Necrons were old, but that old. Of course, I couldn't take anything they told us at a face value. Your lord still hasn't introduced himself, it's only polite to do so, I pointed out. If we lived, we would at least have a name of this Xeno in case the Empire ran into it again. Besides, hopefully my question would be enough to stave off the building explosion for a bit longer. Apologies, human, even the Necron stasis technology isn't perfect. Non-vital data had been highly compressed and sequestered to secondary databanks. A lot of it has been either corrupted or lost for good. My lord currently can't recall his proper designation. The good news is that his tactical and strategic combat memories and capabilities were preserved, while my lord lacks comprehensive memories pertaining politics and how those might lead to your side shooting you for working with us. Perhaps a deal can be struck. My lord promises to put a good word with the Necron naval units, which will arrive to reinforce this world, and do his utmost to convince them not to use you as target practice. That envoy could have chosen its words better. I swear he was trying to stir us all up without being too blatant about it. The outrage from our military contingent wasted no time in materializing. Enough, I snapped as loud as I could, without using warp fuckery to enhance my voice, before this mess could comprehensively get out of hand and see us all killed. Inquisitor, do you expect us to let such a provocation go unpunished? Someone exclaimed boldly from the back of the crowd clumped within the CP. I expect you all to carry yourselves with the integrity, discipline, and honor the Emperor expects from us all, I shot back. If the muttering that followed was anything to go by, I did score a few brownie points with the General and his top advisors, something that could come in useful in the future. I couldn't have put it better, Inquisitor. The Necron Lord's voice continued to be distinctly unhelpful. What deal do you have in mind? I looked at the towering metal figure as I spoke. My lord has observed your technology, and while it is primitive in the extreme, there should be various odds and ends in our vaults that might just be obsolete and old enough your people might find them useful. We have no need of any captured enemy technology, with the exception of what the Eldari use. It's obsolete at best, and we have no need nor use of their toys. As it spoke, I glanced warily at our Martian contingent. The binary chanting, screeching, and the mechadendris waving around grew more and more agitated by the minute. Some of it was obviously too happy for comfort. We'll have to keep a close eye on the cogboys and girls, yet too many were clearly enraged by the insinuations fielded by the Xeno. The voice might have been blithely ignoring what was happening, however his superior apparently didn't. My lord will owe you one as well, and if at all possible, will mediate in a future encounters between you humans and the Necrons. Hopefully, such mediation will prevent the human squatter population upon another tomb world, or 10 from being exterminated when its rightful owners awake and properly retake control of it. This is preposterous. It's heresy. Why are we even listening to the abominable Xeno? Because all previous encounters I'm vaguely aware of ended up in a disaster, or extremely costly victories, if you can call them that. I stretched the truth. While what I just said felt right, there wasn't really much I knew for a fact about any previous encounters between the Imperium and the Necrons. Except the obvious. They were very old, very powerful, and until now didn't deign to speak with us. The Inquisitor is correct. The few encounters I know of between us and these aliens were extremely bloody affairs. While it galls me to admit it, we are in no position to fight a three-front war and win. At best, we might not lose for a time, and even that plays in the traitor's hands. We need to purge the chaos taint from the Deimos Peninsula before it's too late. Captain Thule pleasantly surprised me, with him supporting, or at least not speaking aloud against an alliance of convenience. This might just work, if it wasn't a trap in the first place anyway. And what do you expect in exchange, Necron Lord? I asked. Our forces will not engage each other. We will eliminate the Eldari and Tau as threats so we could concentrate on the larger danger. In the name of cooperation, I must admit that there are rogue Necron units operating on this planet. They're refusing any and all orders, and the only thing they care about is killing everything living that catches their attention. They're to be neutralized with extreme prejudice. Of course, it had to say something like that, just as we were about to take a step back from the prospect of utter disaster. Emperor, damn that thing. I was sorely tempted to fry it with my warp powers, and damn the danger and the consequences. The envoy blithely ignored the stir its declaration caused and continued to speak on. Our best guess on the enemy strategy is that the Eldari would use their abominable powers and mobility to engage critical targets behind your outer defensive lines. We'll have strike teams ready to teleport in the moment we detect them. We'll pin them in place, and together with you forces they were meant to target, we will overwhelm and destroy the raiding parties in detail. At the same time, we will deploy what little heavy forces we will be able to make ready to strike at the rear of the Tau assault columns, attacking your defenses. That might work, in theory. The odds are great that my boys and girls will shoot first and ask questions never when they see Xenotroops in their sights. General Alexander cut in. Our forces are nothing like those Eldari whims and the primitive blueskins. You can't mistake them. They're nothing like humans, and in everyone's experience, aliens were out to get us killed or worse since forever, Alexander stressed. A larger concern, if we actually agree to this, is the possibility of your rogue forces coming in at the worst possible time and causing this potential alliance to fall apart, I added. One of my primary objectives is going to be to hunt down these renegades. So far, they're in limited numbers, primarily the guard forces left under the control of the Command Intelligence, which was meant to take care of this world while we slumbered. However, at this time, my lord can't say for certain that all the forces we'll be putting out of stasis would have retained their sanity. While we will retaliate if fired upon without provocation, we will take no umbrage if your soldiers have to take down rogue units. This was getting better and better already. At this rate, if I lived long enough to make contact with a proper Inquisitor, I was going to be so fucked Slaanesh would be taking notes. Of course, living that long was a questionable prospect, given the state of our Mechanicus contingent and the dirty looks certain officers were throwing my way. We'll need more in order to keep to this alliance, especially if it is to survive the arrival of our reinforcements. I cut in, like a guarantee that you will be vacating this world once it becomes practical. Let's be serious, Inquisitor. What happens after we have dealt with our mutual problems would entirely depend on whose reinforcements arrive first and in what numbers. At that point, the best either of us could do is to plead with our people to honor our alliance. That said, depending on the state of our facilities on this world, it is actually not in the question that we might be forced to ultimately take anything useful, demolish the rest and leave. So you might get your wish. Those words actually made many of my compatriots relax a fraction. Do we have an accord, or should we simply leave and watch the Eldari Tau alliance have their wicked way with you humans, while we dig in and prepare to hold our stronghold until relieved. I looked around. No one was particularly happy with the current development, with the very obvious exception of a group of Martians. "General, Captain Thule," I asked. "As the ranking representative of the Ordo Xenos, my opinion is that given the circumstances, a tenuous alliance with the Necrons on Kronus is in the Empire's interest for the time being. What say you?" "Well, we might get shot as traitors for this. However, if this is going to give us a better fighting chance against the other aliens and the Chaos, then I'll grudgingly agree." Alexander reluctantly offered his support. "I'm not looking forward to explaining this to our superiors, much less the Inquisition at large. However, I have to agree. The tactical and strategic situation here on Kronus is less than ideal. In that case, we do have an alliance, no matter how short-lived it might turn out to be. Hopefully my fellow Inquisitors weren't going to torture me to death as a traitor and a heretic for signing up on this,"